Our next speaker is Professor Stewart Lockie. So I think Trish is going to bring up your slides for you, Stewart, and he's going to be talking to us about integrity and so what assurance monitoring, audits and oversight do we need to ensure integrity in environmental markets. Professor Lockie is an environmental sociologist who's currently the director of the Cairns Institute at James Cook University, and his research addresses environmental governance and risk in a variety of contexts, including climate change, biodiversity conservation, agriculture and food security, the greening of consumption practices, and the social impacts of resource development. So thanks very much for joining us, Stuart.
Well, thanks, Rachel, and thanks for having me. And I'll probably, start banging on my keyboard trying to change slides at some point. So when you see that, you'll know that it's time to switch on. I'm coming to you from Irukandji country in far north Queensland, north of Cairns, and I've chosen as my background today a shot of Green Island, which is traditionally used by Gumganji and Irukandji people, partly because I've been stuck at home for 2 months with a badly broken foot, and partly because one of the things that, even as a sociologist, intrigues me about the challenge of integrity in environmental markets is dealing with our incredibly diverse landscapes and dealing with the range of anthropogenic pressures on those landscapes. I'm a program leader in the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. Many of you won't be familiar with it, but it's a over $100 million multi-institutional R&D program, which is investigating ways of building resilience into coral reefs. A side project has been established looking at the development of biodiversity credits suitable for coral reef environments. And some of the real challenges there revolve around dealing with a reference condition that will be heavily impacted by climate change. You're all aware, of course, of the extent of catastrophic coral bleaching, not just in the Great Barrier Reef, but in coral reefs worldwide. So in all of the work there around the reef, there's that issue of what the reference case looks like and how to manage that. And the other thing that we're very focused on is figuring out what it really means to be involving reef traditional owners in these opportunities and making sure that that's not a token exercise and has its own integrity measures. Now, when I accepted the invitation to talk, I probably should have looked at the title of the proposed talk a little bit more carefully and said, "Oh goodness, that sounds like something that you need someone who's actually got some expertise in assurance monitoring and auditing to have a look at, rather than a sociologist." But since you did pick a sociologist, then you're stuck with a sociological take on these things, which is best to look at their at technically what we might do around assurance, and a bit of a look at some of the social and political issues that surround issues like assurance, monitoring and auditing. So if we go to the next slide, and okay, integrity. So, yep, okay, stop there, that's good. So why would I problematize the idea of integrity in markets? Now, sometimes the language that's most prone to causing confusion and misinterpretation is the language we use every day. So we all know that integrity has two meanings: one around honesty, truthfulness, doing the right thing, adhering to moral principles, and another one around completeness and wholeness. And the way the words are used in technically around markets are pretty similar, but anyone who has ever had to supervise people who need to fill in forms knows that when we formalize things like integrity, sometimes we rub up against informal conventions around integrity. And when it comes to markets, it's important to keep in mind the same thing. There are formal rules around markets, Markets don't exist without governments creating things like property law and frameworks for implementing that law and making sure those markets can operate properly. Markets also don't exist without a whole bunch of informal conventions around how people behave. And sometimes these things work together beautifully, and other times they rub up against each other in ways that cause confusion and resistance. But they're both really important to establishing trust. And so when we ask that question, what assurance, monitoring, audits, and oversight do we need? In one way, the simple answer and the not at all flippant answer is that we need the minimum necessary to maintain trust. If buyers and sellers trust, if buyers and sellers are able to use that market as a means to come together and transact, then we have fit for purpose assurance, monitoring, and auditing. But we shouldn't, to labour the point, assume that when we use those words, we're necessarily always talking about the same thing. The next slide. I wanted to highlight that when I look through the program, not surprisingly, most of the examples of environmental markets that were being discussed relate to various forms of ecosystem service market. So there's some sort of financial reward in place, or the groundwork is being done to enable that financial reward to be in place for providing an ecosystem service, such as maintaining or increasing biodiversity. Given that the NRM regions deal with landholders on all sorts of things, I thought it's worth bearing in mind the complexity around what environmental markets, instruments and opportunities landholders are actually dealing with. So broadly speaking, sustainable development agenda there is just a shorthand for all of the international agreements that are influencing environmental governance. And most things like the Convention on Biological Diversity now reference the the 2030 Sustainable Development Agreement as a starting point. My second point there to bear in mind is that when it comes to environmental regulation, private sector actors are critically important, and they don't always work in lockstep with government. So in terms of market instruments, there's a lot of corporate civil society, multi-stakeholder platform involvement. In terms of market instruments themselves, we have some of the oldest market instruments around are probably the eco-labelling type initiatives. We have offset markets. The whole Kyoto Protocol in the early 90s seemed to revolve around offsetting for greenhouse gas equivalents, and we also have offset frameworks for biodiversity. We've got the ecosystem service markets for water quality, biodiversity. Now, while the national nature market is nascent, it's coming together now, as we heard. We've also got very long-standing markets, either for providing ecosystem services or for access to tradable natural resources like water. There's a lot of interest in the idea of private equity coming in to fund conservation and nature-based solutions through these various kinds of market instrument. I would just point out, and I don't point this out in order to be cynical, I point it out in order to be realistic. To date, through many attempts at developing markets in ecosystem services, the primary buyer has been government. So there may have been an aim to use those instruments to leverage private capital. There's been varied success with that. There's a bit of an assumption that having mandatory sustainability reporting and environmental disclosures will address that. So we don't need to go into the detail of what environment sustainability governance reporting could look like. There's different frameworks. It was in the Kunming-Montreal agreement for the Convention of Biological Diversity in 2022, that signatories agreed that introduction of mandatory reporting of biodiversity-related risks would be introduced worldwide. Now, the agreement was only that mandatory reporting would apply to very large businesses. Now, I forget what the threshold was, but we're talking businesses that turn over in the hundreds of millions. Now, you would think, well, that's probably not going to affect most landholders, but the issue is that the people who buy agricultural produce are likely to be at some point subject to those kinds of compulsory disclosures. So we can reasonably expect that expectations to report on biodiversity risk, climate risk, etc., will feed their way back up the supply chain, and it will be something that farmers have to deal with. The other thing I mentioned there is environmental trade barriers. I think it was in 21, the EU started introducing carbon border adjustments. At this stage, that's really only a pilot. It applies to iron, steel, aluminium, very, very carbon intensive products. But the intent was and is to see how that worked and to consider rolling it out to other imports. And of course, other countries are looking at that quite carefully, because the argument goes, we're regulating our industry to bring down carbon emissions. Why should we give other people a free hand? So my point here is not to get into the detail of all these instruments, but to point out that when we're talking with landholders about market opportunity, we just need to be a bit aware that it's actually quite a crowded space. My last point there about standards-based regulation just speaks to one of the mechanisms through which we regulate these various kinds of market instruments. So next slide. And again, here, I don't want to get into unnecessary detail, but I wanted to point out that there's quite there's a number of ways this can be approached. I've divided it up into 4: product standards, production standards, performance standards, and process standards. Product standards basically say this is what something looks like. Probably not going to be so relevant around most of the environmental markets. Production standards, however, where we tell people they have to do something a particular way. This is kind of the classic approach to regulating organic agriculture, for example, through lists of things you were and weren't allowed to use. And this could become part of biodiversity standards. We could say there's a particular methodology that you have to follow for revegetation, for example. Performance standards relate to what do you achieve through all this. Now, with the cassowary credit, and I certainly won't steal Terrain NRM's thunder by going into detail on the cassowary credit scheme. You know, in tropical rainforests, you're looking about 100 years to re-establish anything like tertiary forest biodiversity. So that's an unreasonable kind of benchmark. So the performance standard perhaps is questionable, but there is reasonable intelligence on how you can go about doing restoration in a way that will over time lead to those sorts of outcomes. And then process standards are more risk-based approaches where businesses are expected to identify, this relates more to the ESG reporting and environmental disclosures. What are the risks? How are you managing the risks? Show us that you're doing that in an appropriate sort of way. Next slide. So far I've talked about the diversity of environmental market that landholders may have to interact with. I talked about the diverse ways in which those markets might be regulated. And my rationale is not to highlight diversity for its complexity for its own sake, but of course, one of the very roles of NRMs is to help landholders navigate complexity. The third domain of complexity I want to talk about was something I've very cryptically titled "Who Benefits and Who Pays." So one click. So in any of these projects, we're going to produce a range of public and private goods. Landholder might benefit from increased biodiversity. might be biodiversity that has its own market value that can be sold in some way. It might be that it provides an ecosystem service, manages pest control or pollination or what have you. And of course, there can be public benefits. So private benefits, public benefits could be better water quality, better long-term biodiversity outcomes. One more click. Then there's also a question of, well, what's the landholder responsible for? Should they be providing this, even public goods, without any additional assistance? Or is that unreasonable? Should they be subsidised, or are they incapable of doing it for themselves and need some kind of subsidy in order to do that? So my point here is that it's not obvious that public money, corporate money, any other money, consumer money should be going to a landholder in order to enable them to provide a public good environmental outcome. That's a decision that we take as a community that we think that may be appropriate. So maybe just do 4 quick clicks, just put them all out here. So these classifications here are quite are imperfect, but just for the sake of argument, you can see, well, the sort of top-down regulation that we see with, say, vegetation management legislation, we know that vegetation provides a range of public and private goods, and we expect landholders to look after it anyway. Sustainability disclosures, we know that people benefit from their access to natural resources, and we expect them to manage them appropriately. Alternatively, we might see an argument to be providing some kind of subsidy through offset markets, through eco-labelling, through ecosystem service markets. So last slide. It's actually I should have said, I've done a number of research projects where one thing we've found is that access to markets can have perverse outcomes. So we do need to be alert to that possibility. So the 3 things I just wanted to raise as discussion points were the role of NRMs in helping people navigate the complexity of markets, individual markets like the new national environmental market will be complex enough, but bearing in mind people have these other opportunities and constraints. Where possible, harmonisation of technical requirements would be really helpful, because as you can imagine, a farm business is also, quite possibly got requirements around, private food safety standards, HACCP requirements, all sorts of reporting requirements. So harmonisation of those can be really helpful. And the other thing is, fostering public dialogue around what isn't reasonable for people to do, rather than assuming that there's only one position on markets. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Fantastic.